In this big idea video, the topic I really want to hit on is the idea of American expansion, expanding beyond its own borders, set borders, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And what I mean by expansion is I mean the expansion of territory, the expansion of U.S. Economic interests, political interests, and also the expansion of American social and cultural ideology and traditions and values and things like that. They're all kind of part of the same idea during this time period. The idea that America is going to expand beyond the traditional borders of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and these themes will become more prevalent in the rest of the world. Now, whenever I talk about expansion as a term, what I'm really referring to is the idea of empire, the idea of imperialism, which whenever I say that term in 2022, has a really negative connotation to it, right? Like nobody wants to be considered an empire. Empire is bad. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that's not really the case. Although there are some who say during that time period that empire is bad. But for a lot of people, the idea of having an empire is good. It's a positive attribute for your country. It shows your country's powerful. It shows your country's dominant. And so to have an empire means to have status. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, if you wanted to be a modernized, civilized, considered to be anyway, modernized, civilized nation society, you had an empire. All the greats had it. England, of course, being the largest, most popular, most well-known anyway. France, Germany, all of these nations had empires. And so whenever we talk about America during this time period, there's going to be a push for a more imperial nation during this time as well. Now, this is not new, right? So when we think about the idea of how America has grown, how the U.S. has grown over the decades before 1890, blah, blah, blah. From a certain perspective, the U.S. has always been an imperial expansionist nation. We started out as 13 states and then began moving west, acquiring more territory, more states, bringing more people under our control. And so from a certain perspective, there has been this idea of America as an empire from the very beginning. And it's even kind of carved into our DNA a little bit. We've talked about before the idea, the topic of manifest destiny, that it's God's will that Americans are meant to spread American ideals, culture, values, and bring civilization and modernity to other parts of the United States, especially moving westward during this period. And so the idea becomes, well, if that's our manifest destiny, why stop at the Pacific shoreline? Why not spread America's manifest destiny, keep spreading it to other parts of the world? And so that's sort of the where we start this conversation about America and the idea of empire. The impulse has always been there to a certain degree. By the end of the 19th century, though, we're going to start looking beyond the United States, the continent of North America itself, to other parts of the world for various reasons. So let's look at some of the factors, some of the reasons why we begin to cast our gaze beyond our own borders. So we can start by looking at this from an economic perspective. By the end of the 19th century, the United States economy, the industrialization of the U.S. is really booming. We're producing goods for consumers to buy. We're producing goods that can be used to help build a country's infrastructure like railroads, electricity, things like that. And so the idea becomes, well, let's expand these markets. If our businesses, if our companies want to grow and expand, we have to look beyond the American consumer, the American market. We have to look elsewhere. Places like England, Europe in general, to South America, the Caribbean, to Asia, especially. China was kind of the goal. So many people in China who want our stuff, we thought. So we need to start selling things to the Chinese, or selling our goods in places like France and Germany. That will bring more money to our businesses and help our national economy expand and continue to expand. So one of the factors behind this growth is the idea of economic expansion. Another factor in all of this is the idea of ideology. So if you take the concept of manifest destiny, that Americans are destined, ordained to spread their unique culture and ideas and values to the rest of the world, then the idea became, well, let's keep spreading this to other parts, other countries that need our values, our culture. And so the idea of spreading ideology goes hand in hand with the idea of expansion for the United States during this period. Now, in a way, this is kind of considered to be a positive at the time, but looking back on it, it's associated with the idea of social Darwinism, scientific racism, the idea that there are certain, at the time anyway, that there are certain more superior groups of people, more superior cultures, and that those quote-unquote superior cultures should dominate and spread their culture to the less superior, the inferior cultures around the world. And so there are a lot of people in the United States who believe that, yes, we have one of the dominant cultures, and so therefore we should be spreading this to help those poor people elsewhere become more civilized, modernized, and more like us. So you have an economic reason, you have an ideological reason. There's also the idea of status, that by the end of the 19th century, the U.S. is kind of coming into its own. And so we want to be considered equals to England and to France and to Germany. And those countries have empires. They control possessions elsewhere around the world. And so therefore we too, to achieve that social status in the world, need to also become an empire as they have. You can also link to that the idea that for an economy to really be flourishing, you have to have these little pieces of territory elsewhere in the world just to have as markets. And also because if you're going to have some sort of vast economic empire, you're going to need ships sailing across the water. And in order to make sure that those ships that sail across the water have places to stop and refuel, that are places of safety, you have to have territories that you control to allow those ships to stop. So the idea of acquiring territory is both a status, and the idea of acquiring territory as a way to help ensure the safety of your expanding economy were also important motivations, important factors in the idea of America expanding overseas. So we have status, we have economic side of things, and we have an ideological side of all of this. So these are the reasons why the United States people in the United States begin to promote the idea of expanding America's territory elsewhere in the world and presence elsewhere in the world. Now, there were those who said that this was not something the United States needed to do. By the time we get into the early 1900s, there will be a large and vocal anti-imperialist component of American culture and society. And their arguments are against the idea of spreading American territory, acquiring more territory as part of the United States. Because during this time period we acquire Puerto Rico, the Philippines, various islands in the Pacific Ocean. We gain more control over places in the Caribbean, like Cuba. Even though it's not an American territory, it's still heavily controlled by the United States. There are American business interests in Central America and the Caribbean that the United States is becoming more and more involved in and more controlling over. And there's a pushback against that by certain groups in the United States. And one of the more prominent was called the Anti-Imperialist League. And their arguments against empire, for all those who were arguing for empire at the time in the U.S., their arguments against empire consisted of a few factors as well. First and foremost, they said that it was very hypocritical of the United States to promote these ideas of individualism, of freedom, of self-determination, while at the same time controlling other countries and other parts of the world. So if America stands for the idea of democracy, the ideas of self-determination, we ourselves fought a war to rid ourselves of a colonial empire. Why in the world are we doing this ourselves now around the world? So that was one argument by the anti-imperialists. We are a nation that prides itself on being independent, having gained our independence from another nation. Why would we do that to somebody else? Also, the idea of, as I look through my notes real fast, two more. Number one, empire would cost too much money. It takes a lot of money to have possessions and territories elsewhere in the world. You need to be able to support the people there. You need to be able to maintain a military presence. And so that all costs money. So do we really want to spend the money to have a vast empire around the globe? So that was the second argument. And finally, a third argument to consider from the anti-imperialist point of view. And it kind of, much like social Darwinism and the idea of pro-empire, that it's our duty to spread our advanced civilization to the lesser people. The anti-imperialists used a similar line of reasoning, racial reasoning, to say, do we really want these inferior people to be associated with the United States? Do we really want the burden to take care of them and improve their lives? And again, this is the ideas of the time that are gaining dominance that I'm talking about here. Do we really want this burden to be our burden? And so anti-imperialists said the reason why we don't want empire is because we don't want all of that, all of the stuff that comes with it in terms of taking care of other groups, and so on and so forth. So those are the ideological reasons for empire and the ideological reasons for those who said, no, we don't want an empire. So as you read through the materials and listen to the lectures this week, think about that in terms of that's kind of the starting point for what happens next in this story.